First broadcast on the 7th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme, France has a budget and still has a government. But what is the next bump in the road? Also ahead, the European Union begins filling sandbags in anticipation of a trade war with the United States. Later in the show, the scale of the damage done by US President Donald Trump's gutting of USAID begins to become apparent.
This whole process is completely chaotic. They didn't do any study of what aid does. In fact, the young people that work for Musk they're techies. They don't understand development work or emergency work. I don't even know if they've ever traveled.
And we will hear from Monocle's team on the road and on the train in Switzerland. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. We have long since passed the point at which everything broadly serene and functional in French politics would be a bigger headline than crisis in French politics. But nevertheless, to the crisis in French politics. It may seem on the face of it currently less crisis-y than in recent months. The government of Prime Minister François Bayrou has survived a vote of confidence in the National Assembly, which means that the budget he bounced past truculent representatives stands and he can attempt some actual governing. But for how long? Well, I'm joined now by Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris bureau chief. Simon, Bayrou obviously succeeded where his predecessor Michel Barnier failed. How did he do it?
Bonjour, Andrew. Well, I think the best way to say it is that he managed to get some movement going on a pretty sclerotic political chessboard. So the previous dynamic under Barnier was that Marine Le Pen and her troops from the Rassemblement National were the kingmakers. They were the ones who had the government's survival in their hands. And now Bayrou has managed to sideline them and put his fate in the hands of the moderate left, which is now the key partner for Bayrou's government. So he achieved that by making a number of concessions to the socialists. For example, the previous budget was going to eliminate 4,000 teaching jobs. Now all 4,000 are staying. There was also a significant increase in this 2025 budget that just passed for healthcare and hospitals, which the socialists touted as a concession that they extracted from them. And then the big one is that he's agreed to putting President Emmanuel Macron's signature retirement reform, which pushed back the age of retirement from 62 to 64, back on the political operating table, so to speak.
Was there also perhaps a thing where opposition MPs started to worry that if they unloaded another government, voters would start to blame them rather than the governments and rather than Macron?
Absolutely. You're 100% correct about that, Andrew. This is a big deal. It is a significant achievement as well for Bayrou and his team. So they can claim some credit for it, but it's definitely a different kettle of fish to think about what policy trade-offs lie ahead versus can we get a budget approved, because nobody wanted to be seen by voters as carrying the bag for tanking the budget and potentially the entire French economy with it.
I mean, so to the budget itself, what does it tell us about what kind of government Bayrou wants to run? Who wins and who loses from it?
Well, I think that it is emblematic of the kind of political tightrope act that he's going to have to walk for as long as he's in charge. The key thing to remember here is that the context for all of this horse trading over which ministry gets what budget and what gets funded and what doesn't is the pretty dire state of France's public finances. So cutting overall spending by the government, preferably by a lot, was imperative to reassure France's lenders and financial markets. But some ministries, such as Defense, Interior, and Justice, all got a big boost in funding. And that's both because Bayrou has the right-wing Les Républicains, kind of conventional right party who are allies of his government to placate, and those are their policy priorities. But it's also because he wants to show voters that he's tough enough on immigration. He even resorted to using some language at the Assemblée that you normally only hear from Le Pen and company. So he's also trying to keep them in check, clearly. And then on the loser side, the labor ministry is the big one with a giant 4 billion euro cut. That's 17% of its budget. That means that workforce-related subsidies on things like reskilling or incentives to hire apprentices and so on are going to be drastically diminished. Foreign aid also got slashed by a full third. And crucially, the environment and climate related expenses went up slightly, but are nowhere near where they need to be to allow France to meet its environmental targets. And on politically, I mean, we've got the socialists are the big winners. We already mentioned that, but we also should mention the big losers, who are the far left, La France Insoumise, who have heretofore adopted a kind of my way or the highway approach, and the rest of the left-leaning parties, including the socialists, were following their lead. Now they're the ones kind of sidelined along with the Rassemblement National. So they have been crying foul and calling the socialists kind of traitors to the leftist cause, but they have no influence anymore.
So how clear a road does the Prime Minister have in front of him now? Is he going to be able to do actual governing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key phrase is one that has been making the rounds a lot in the French press ever since these early elections last summer yielded this kind of hung parliament, basically, or equally divided parliament. It's text par text. So each specific policy action will have to be arbitrated by, ad hoc coalitions. So Bayrou's likely going to have to team up with the far right to get these immigration bills that a lot of his allies want and a lot of French voters want. And then the left will be unhappy about that and will probably subject him to votes of no confidence over them. And then conversely, to keep the moderate left on side on economics, he's going to have to make sure that he doesn't go too far in that direction. Otherwise, he risks losing allies from his own camp, President Macron's party, or the moderate right, who are a lot thriftier than the socialists. So he's really not out of the woods yet, but he has demonstrated that he's capable of navigating these kind of uncharted political waters that we're in right now.
Simon Bouvier in Monocle's Paris bureau, thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. Here is Tom Webb with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Donald Trump has imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court, accusing the body of improperly targeting the United States and Israel. The order includes financial sanctions and visa restrictions on ICC officials. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed the decision. The US and Israel are not members of the court. Sweden's government says it will tighten gun laws in the country after the deadliest mass shooting in Sweden's history. 10 people were killed at an adult education centre in the city of Örebro earlier this week, reportedly by a 35-year-old man who was using his own licensed rifles. And Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba will visit Donald Trump in Washington later today, the second foreign leader to visit the White House after Netanyahu. The two men are expected to discuss business and security ties, and Ishiba will be hoping to create a similar rapport that Trump had in his first term with former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Tom. You are listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. As of this broadcast, US President Donald Trump has only explicitly threatened the sovereign territory of one European country, but early days. He has, however, menaced the continent entire, the European Union to be slightly more specific, with the prospect of a trade war, appending the epithet an atrocity to the United States trade deficit with the EU, which he cited variously as 300 billion and 350 billion US dollars, neither of which is remotely accurate. According to the Office of the US Trade Representative, it was $131 billion in 2022, which isn't nothing, but still. I'm joined now by Dan Michaels, Brussels Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal. Dan, first of all, the question which I think has to be applied to every outburst of President Trump, do we think he's serious about this?
It seems he's serious about doing something vis-a-vis Europe, whether it will be specifically tariffs, what it will target, when it'll happen is still far from clear.
I mean, has he sort of given any hint of what he proposes to tariff in particular, or would this be a blanket tariff similar to those that he has imposed on China and threatened Canada and Mexico with?
Well, as we've learned, he does seem to like a degree of unpredictability. So no, we don't know. It could be on certain products or areas. He's talked a lot about cars. The EU tariffs on American cars are slightly higher than US tariffs on European cars. Could be something like that. In his first administration, he put tariffs on European steel and aluminum. Or it could be something not manufactured. It could be something related to digital technology. That's a flashpoint between the US and EU. US has the world's big tech companies. Europe is regulating them, and that doesn't make a lot of people. That makes a lot of people in the US unhappy.
That aspect, regulation, is that possibly the real reason for the bee in his bonnet that he does have about the European Union? Because the trade deficit's not really that big a thing, is it? I mean, by which I mean it's not the EU's fault if American voters buy more European stuff than Europeans buy American.
Well, I guess first on that, Trump has said that Europe takes advantage of the US. So it seems that from his perspective, fault does lie with Europe for how the European economy is structured, issues like that. But that said, he's also been very critical of European regulation. A lot of Europeans are critical of European regulation. Business people say there are a lot of challenges to doing business in Europe. American business has a huge presence in Europe nonetheless. And American businesses are among the best at profiting from the EU single market. Giant global American corporations can handle the complexities of Europe, and having one brand across 27 countries is great for a lot of American companies. But there are a growing number of EU regulations in fields like digital privacy, artificial intelligence, cutting edge digital areas, and that rubs a lot of people in the American business community and political community the wrong way.
If, though, he is serious about these tariffs, if he does impose them and does stick to them, I mean, it would provide a jolt to the US economy as well, wouldn't it? Or at least certainly to American consumers.
If the price of products from Europe goes up, that definitely will ripple through the U.S. economy. That said, a lot of the European products in the U.S. are actually made in the U.S. And the value of goods imported from Europe is much smaller than the value of European products made in the U.S. One standout example is that BMW has a factory in South Carolina that is actually a net exporter from the US, and BMW exports SUVs from South Carolina to Europe. So the picture it's a little more complicated than it looks on the surface.
But to bring it back to his vexations about the trade deficit, even if he's perhaps not necessarily clear on how big it actually is, objectively speaking, is a trade deficit necessarily a bad thing? I mean, it's not like the United States is not the world's biggest economy despite it.
Yeah, economists will say that in some ways it's a sign of a healthy economy. Clearly, the U.S. has economic issues It needs to sort out, and obviously the administration wants to tackle things like the federal budget deficit, which also is an issue. The EU Trade Commissioner this week pointed out that the US trade deficit with the EU is about 3% of the value of trade. So it's quite small in the bigger picture. And so, no, the imbalance between the US and EU on trade in goods is really quite small in the broader context, and especially in the context of all the investment going across the Atlantic. The economic relationship, even the U.S. Office of the Trade Representative called it the deepest and most complex economic relationship in the world.
Do you get any sense there in Brussels of how the EU proposes to respond to these tariffs, to this trade war, if and when it comes? I mean, could they adopt the model we have already seen from Mexico and Canada, whereby you basically just solemnly promise to do something that you were already doing anyway and let Trump call it a massive victory?
That is the approach that the EU took during the first Trump administration. The EU pledged to buy more soybeans and natural gas from the U.S., both of which worked well for the EU, but both of which it was doing already. In the current situation, people in Brussels are talking about, again, buying more liquefied natural gas from the U.S., buying more weapons, because that is an important thing for Europe with the war in Ukraine, and other products from the U.S. Both of those things, likely were or would happen anyway. On top of that, if there is a trade war, the EU might also hit back with very targeted tariffs of its own, again, as it did during the first administration and as Canada and Mexico threatened to this time.
Dan Michaels in Brussels for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. The US Foreign Aid Agency, USAID, will see thousands of staff from around the world put on administrative leave later today. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has protected less than 300 staff out of more than 10,000, as the agency is likely being folded entirely into the State Department. Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with Andrew Natsios, former head of USAID under President George W. Bush, about the importance of the American Aid Agency.
Well, for me, is different from the public. Food security is one of the most important issues for me. My great uncle starved to death in Greece during the Great Famine, during the Nazi occupation, where the Germans stripped the country of food and to feed Rommel's army in North Africa. So, and that's a big thing in our family. I was brought up in those stories. And then there was the communist insurgency, and they kidnapped 30,000 Greek children and brought them to Moscow during the Civil War. I mean, so I've been through this in a personal sense. And so I have spent a lot of time in civil wars, famines, refugee emergencies on the emergency side. AID is the dominant force in the world at this, or it was, for about 40% of the money spent internationally in emergencies and is spent by AID. The DART teams, which I actually started myself when I was director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance under Bush 41, the elder Bush. In 1989, we launched the first one in 1990 to extend humanitarian power into the far reaches of the world in civil wars and famines mostly. And that's become highly sophisticated now. The teams used to be 5, now they're 125. Those are all shut down, all of them.
Andrew, what have you made not only of this decision to essentially shut down USAID, but the way that they've gone about it?
One of my former students, who's been with AID for 7 years, he said, they just sent me a note, and I'm in the middle of a civil war, and I just was told I was fired, and I don't even know how I'm going to get home now. So this whole process is completely chaotic. And secondly, they didn't do any study of what AID does. In fact, the young people that work for Musk they're techies. They don't understand development work or emergency work. I don't even know if they've ever traveled. And he keeps making these comments about the bag of worms and corruption, they're criminals. It's utter nonsense. I've worked for run seven institutions over the last 45 years, The career people at AID are the most competent managers with the highest ethics. And I like being at the head of AID. Many of them are Democrats, but they do what the Republicans want when the Republicans are in charge. When the Democrats are in charge, they do what the Democrats ask. So some of the stuff that the Biden administration was doing on culture issues, I think is inappropriate. I don't think AID should be involved in it. And that's what the administration is using to bash AID. That was a decision of the White House, not the career service at AID. The career people at AID will do whatever the administrator wants if they treat them with respect and they work with them in a constructive way.
Andrew, as you say, many of those who work at USAID are nonpartisan, essentially willing to work with different administrations. If you were to try and convince a Republican administration, as you were a part of, that USAID is important, that it matters for national security, what would you say?
I'm a conservative Republican. I'm not on the left of the Republican Party or the moderate wing of the Republican Party. Not there's as much of that left anymore. But I think this protects the national interest of the United States in several ways. One, our health programs next to our emergency program are the largest in the agency, the Health Bureau, the Global Health Bureau. We have health programs in 90 countries. That is an early warning system for disease outbreaks. Now, there's a huge aid mission in Uganda. By the way, they're shutting down all of the aid missions and sending all of the Foreign Service officers back to Washington. I'm just appalled by that. That's our early warning system if there's going to be a pandemic somewhere. And we have a huge global supply chain that's highly efficient, and we can move stuff within 48 hours, including vaccines. There's a vaccine for Ebola now. They should be vaccinating everybody in Kampala. Well, the whole system's shutting down because of these cuts. Why are we doing that? The notion that we can stop these diseases at the border of our country is delusional. You stop it at the source, which is in the interest of the country that we're in, and it's in our interest. It's in the European interest to do that. There's no disease lobby that's pro-disease in any capital in the world. It's in everybody's interest to control these diseases. How do you do that? With aid missions in the field. Most of our staff is in the field, and most of our staff are not Americans. They're Ugandans, they're Kenyans, they're Peruvians, they're Nigerians. I mean, they're highly skilled, these people from the developing world who work for AID and have worked for AID for many, many years. So I think shutting this all down the way they're doing it, I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. They're destroying infrastructure that's been built up for many years that is highly accountable and that has an impact in these countries. We've saved 25 million people's lives with a PEPFAR program that was started by a Republican president, President Bush, to stop the AIDS pandemic, particularly in Africa, where it was raging. We have a huge malaria initiative that I put in place at the White House instruction, that it's $1.2 billion a year. They've reduced the incidence of malaria in most countries that they're present in Africa by 50% or more. There is a campaign to wipe out polio around the world. I don't understand how that's a partisan issue. Polio is not a partisan issue. The AID, with the Center for Disease Control in the US, and the World Health Organization that we've now withdrawn from, and the European donors and health ministry wiped out smallpox about 50 years ago. There's not been any incidents of smallpox. We're trying to do that with polio. That whole thing is shut down now. I don't think that they thought this through at all. They've been making wild charges. Musk's comments are bold-faced lies. This comment that was made that aid officers are Marxists is baloney. The most pro-business, pro-free market aid agency in the world is USAID. We work with responsible companies, and I'll give you an example of it. We have a thing we started when I was administrator, still exists, called the Global Development Alliance. We've raised $60 billion in private sector money with American corporations and European corporations to jointly fund projects that we've designed and we oversee. We raise $6 billion in money like this around the world through corporations to get into supply chain, which is a way of boosting people's incomes in a way that's sustainable and responsible. Why is that a bad thing? That's not ideological, and that's certainly not Marxist. So I'm a little fed up with listening to all this rhetoric from people who don't know anything about the subject.
That was former USAID Administrator Andrew Natsios speaking with Monocle's Chris Chermak. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and finally on today's show, the latest offering from Monocle's Books Department is our Greece Handbook, available now from Monocle channels. However, our tireless researchers are already at work on the next one, and in a significant clue as to its subject matter, they join me now from Switzerland. Specifically, travelling down the mountain from St. Moritz is Amy van den Berg, Monocle's Deputy Editor of Book Publishing, and on a train to Geneva is from Monocle's editorial team is Claudia Jacob. Claudia, let's start with you first. Anybody who is on a train in Switzerland is automatically somebody I am very jealous of. What have you been up to?
Yeah, I have to say I've experienced some pretty spectacular views. I travelled the other day from Lucerne on the Golden Pass Express to the Bernese Oberland to Gstaad. And yeah, I think these trains are really reminiscent of the sort of Belle Epoque train cars that used to be available to sort of the lucky few. And I think in Switzerland, this idea of train journeys still being a sort of leisure activity really still holds. There are some spectacular views to witness and a very high standard of train car meals. I've noticed. I witnessed a family enjoying a cheese and charcuterie board with wine as we sped through the snow-capped mountains towards Gstaad, and the scenery was really spectacular.
I mean, on Gstaad itself, staying with you, Claudia, it does have a reputation as being a sort of upscale playground for people with, well, probably so much money they don't even need to take the train. But is there more to it than that, in fact?
There absolutely is. I mean, it's definitely true that Gstaad is popular among sort of, or let's say used to be popular among aristocratic holidaymakers and even. But if you dig deeper into the history, there's quite a different story. I mean, pre-World War I, Gstaad was a sort of humble farming hamlet, and this changed quite dramatically when the rail line brought all these sort of bon vivants from all over the world who were in search of an elegant resort where they could spend their holidays. And, you know, today we sort of associate Gstaad with these iconic landmarks like the Gstaad Palace and the Lorenzbach Boutique, which were actually established by very entrepreneurial locals who just spotted an appetite for luxury in the Swiss mountains. Today it's possibly one of the most international resorts in Switzerland. The hotel I stayed at was struggling to identify a nationality they haven't come across in Gstaad. So yeah, a lot of families have been here for generations, and they're really determined to preserve the businesses which have witnessed a transformation from sort of farming hamlet to a very glamorous resort.
Well, let's bring Amy van den Berg, and sticking with the subject of high-altitude resorts. You have been in St. Moritz, home of the Cresta Run.
Hello, yes, I am. I have been in St. Moritz for the past 3 days. I'm now driving to Geneva to meet up with Claudia, so I'll see you soon, Claudia. I'm in the Engadine Valley right now, and it's absolutely gorgeous.
I mean, the Engadine Valley I have reported from for Monocle. It is indeed spectacular, but what are you discovering about Switzerland spending protracted time there? It's one of those places everybody has an idea of, usually regarding reliability and punctuality, but are you finding it conforming to stereotype?
Absolutely. I was saying to someone that I might be 10 minutes late for another interview, and he says, no, you're in Switzerland now. You're not 10 minutes late, especially if you invited them to the interview. So I definitely have become more punctual in Switzerland. But yeah, St. Moritz is such a beautiful place. It has definitely lived up to the classic, beautiful town front of the mountains. I went for a quick ski this morning. It was wonderful. Yeah, it's definitely a clash of cultures, clash of architecture. It's just a really interesting and wonderful place.
Well, we will hear more from both of you before, during and after the book comes out. But for the moment, Amy Vandenberg and Claudia Jacob on the road in Switzerland, thank you for joining us. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb, our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing returns on Monday at the same time, midday UK. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.